What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up another meta report, breaking down all the win rates of all the best decks and the meta share. So let's get into it. So we're gonna kick it off with the meta share breakdown. So as you can see, this week we are looking at the Greninja Tech Box decks. It's basically the Greninja mixed in with a bunch of different tech cards like Marshadow, Hitmonlee, sometimes Druddigon, things like Tauros or Mewtwo. A lot of those cards are being mixed into the Greninja decks, keeping out things like Gyarados, so you can have a ton of cards that you can tech in to answer anything in the meta or any situation you may get into. And then of course we have the Celebi representing the Exeggutor EX and Celebi decks. That's 2 Exeggutor, 2 Celebi, and 2 superior lines. Then we have the Gyarados, which is representing the Gyarados Greninja Druddigon decks. Then we have the Aerodactyl, which is actually basically only the far-fetched version. So Aerodactyl, Marshadow, Hitmonlee, and far-fetched. We did not include the Primeapes in this. However, if we did, it would only increase a little bit more anyways. But anyways, moving on. This week we actually split 2 fire decks. Last week we did not. We only looked at Arcanine. Now we're looking at Charizard, Arcanine Moltres, and Arcanine Moltres Mew EX. And then we're also looking, of course, at Pikachu, specifically the Zeb Strika build, and then Mewtwo Gardevoir. So let's get into it right now. So as you can see, these tech box decks that I've been calling the Greninja, the piece of the pie that's represented by Greninja, is around a 2% meta share. So this is really the only piece of the pie that kind of takes a couple of decks and puts them together, because there's so many different versions. But I would like to include them all together because they are all kind of having their own little bit of success, and they are still topping in tournaments. Last week the last video I did, they actually won a tournament. This week they did not. However, they did still continue to top. But this week they are a representation of the meta share is around 2%, which is not a lot, but it's still pretty interesting considering it's so low, yet they still have a pretty decent top and rate. So the deck has not been super duper popular, yet it is still popular than the best Aerodactyl deck, which we'll get to in a minute. And then as we move into the Exeggutor Celebi, and again, this is only specifically 2 Exeggutor EX with Celebi and Superior. All other Celebi Superior decks do not play 2 Exeggutor EX, and that is the deciding factor in the one I chose, because that is the one with the actual best win rate, which we'll get into later as well. So this Celebi deck, specifically the Exeggutor EX with 2 in the Celebi deck, is only a 4%, which is still very interesting because, again, as I said, they have the best win rate, yet other people are still playing the other versions of the decks. I wonder how long it will take until people click and say, no, I'm going to play the one that has the best win rate and try to make a push with that deck instead. And then as we move on, Gyarados coming in at a whopping 12% meta share. This is the second highest on the chart, which is super interesting, and it makes sense. I was saying in my last video, the top 10 decks of the week that I posted yesterday, that I think it's the second best deck, only second to something like a Pikachu EX, for a couple of reasons, but we won't get into them right now. So it does make sense that it does have such a high meta share, because it is literally one of the best decks in the game. And then when we get into the Aerodactyl piece of the pie, this, again, as I said, is the Aerodactyl Marshadow Hitmonlee deck, and sometimes it techs in decides to play the Primeapes, 2 Primeape lines or 2 Farfetch'd lines. I only looked at the Farfetch'd line for this because, again, it's the one with the best win rate. Next week I could possibly look at both of them combined, but the meta share wouldn't really change that much. And to be honest, when we get to the win rate portion, it would actually drop, even though they're both over a 50%. It would kind of take the average of the two and then actually make the win rate lower. And I want to show what the best deck of those decks is, which is again the Farfetch'd version. So this, because it's the Farfetch'd version, it's 1%, which I will say, and I do know for a fact, it's actually like one of the lower meta shares or popular decks out of all the Aerodactyl decks that I'm talking about, including the Primeape. Sometimes there's versions that play Mew, but the Farfetch'd version seems to be the least popular, but is doing the best. Again, very interesting. And then we get into Charizard, Arcanine. Both have a very similar meta share, around 2%. If you added all the Moltres decks together, including just Charizard Moltres and these two together, it would probably be somewhere around a 6%, but they're both around the same amount of meta share, and I'm not really sure what that attributes to. I think a lot of people just like the fact that they can play a Charizard. It has 200 attack. They can take out any Pokemon in the game, and some like not to have such a bulky deck and have the option of a Mew EX instead of the Charizard. And then as we get into a Pikachu Zebstrika, this is only around a 8% meta share. Now, if we took some of the Raichu builds and stuff like that, or the Pikachu Zapdos builds, that we would probably see this raise a little bit higher, but it doesn't really matter because it's still, this is, first of all, the highest meta share out of all the Pikachu decks, and it's the clear-cut best Pikachu deck, if not the best deck in the game. I think it's the best deck in the game. It wins the most tournaments, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And then Mewtwo. This is still super duper shocking to me because, in my opinion, it's not even my opinion, based off the data, out of all the top decks in the game right now that we're going to be looking at, Mewtwo week after week after week has always kind of had like the lowest win rate. However, again, I always say this, and it's probably true, it probably comes down to the player and as well as the matchups, because even though it has the lowest win rate, it often does seem to have the most tops out of all other decks, or at least very close to some of the other ones, such as Pikachu and Gyarados. So even though this is a very low win rate deck, and again we'll get into that, it is the most popular, and again it gets into the most tops. Now that could also just be a thing because the more decks that are being played of this deck have a higher chance of getting in to tops because there's so many more of them, so that could be a thing too. But anyways, that is the meta share breakdown. Let's get into the win rates. So this is the win rate portion of the video, and we are actually going to start with the Mewtwo because that is the last deck we just talked about in regards to the meta share, and talked about how it is time and time again the highest meta share. It always has around an 18%. Previously it was all the way up to like 26% at one point. It was the most popular deck by far. It still is by far the most popular deck to be playing, but again, as you can see, if you look at all of the win rates together here, Mewtwo always has the lowest win rate, and it's always right around that exact 50%. Now this could be due actually for a couple of reasons. As I said, player or matchup. It's not a super hard deck to play, but it's also not a super easy deck to play, especially since the inclusion of Mythical Slab. It could sometimes become complicated to try and know which cards you should be playing first out of the Professor's Research, the Pokeball, and the Slab. It could also be a -1 if you do not hit anything, and then if you don't hit a Pokemon and you hit a very important card that you need, it goes to the bottom of your deck. But another thing that I thought of is because it has the highest meta share, there's also a very high chance that Mewtwo is constantly fighting Mewtwo, which means it's always going to be stuck around a 50% if they always beat each other. So that could be a very important factor as well. But when you look at other decks, such as the Greninja Tech Box decks that I've been talking about, it's a 51%, and that's the including all the different versions of those decks put into one, which usually means it would average out. So if that is the case, and I'm not even taking the one that's specifically the highest, it's super interesting that that's still higher than the most popular deck, especially since this is one of the decks in Mewtwo, as I said, that gets like one of the highest tops of all of the other decks. But as we move on, and we'll get to Celebi last because I want to talk about that one last after the rest, what we'll do is we'll skip over to Gyarados. As you can see, Gyarados, Charizard, Arcanine, Moltres, and Pikachu all have around a 53% win rate, and these are actually the win rates that I'm taking from Play TCG Limitless, and you can just go on their website, click on decks, filter for Pokemon Pocket, and you can see that these are the win rates. And of course, this is rounding up or rounding down depending on whatever is closest to. But as I said, I'm actually looking more specifically at very much those specific decks and not combined in other decks all together, except for the tech box decks because there's so many different versions. But it's super duper interesting. Listen, it makes sense. 53 and 53 for Gyarados and Pikachu makes a lot of sense. They're two of the best decks in the game, if not the best decks in the game. I think they're the best decks in the game. But what is really surprising is as we get into the Charizard, Arcanine, and Moltres build, this is also a 53%. So this is very underplayed compared to the other decks. However, it still has a very similar win rate. Now, this could be also looking at tournaments that go further past Mythical Islands, so it could be a little bit messed up, which is why I usually try to look at specific tournaments and compile those ones from the last week. However, it takes a lot of time, almost too much time. Sometimes it takes like almost 2 days, especially when you have a full workload, life, and family. It takes way too much. So what I've decided is I'm just going to look at very specific decks, the best ones of each kind of archetype, and look at those decks overall from the period of time that Play TCG Limitless shows us for the win rate breakdown. And as you can see, because we'll continue on here, is Charizard has a higher win rate than Arcanine. Last week, however, when I did this meta report, I had only looked at Arcanine because Arcanine had the Arcanine Moltres build without Charizard had a better win rate in the tournaments I looked at. But again, I just said I'm not looking at specific tournaments anymore. Now I'm looking at overall win rate that the Play TCG Limitless breaks down for us, because it's able to compile all the data I would be looking at anyways, but has a broader spectrum, even if that spectrum is in tournaments that have a lot less people or tournaments that are from further back before Mythical Island. But as we continue on, the Arcanine, as I said, only has a 51%. However, this could also change after week and after week and after week. We get, I think it's like almost like 30 tournaments a week. So this data can significantly change if those decks seem to do better in certain weeks than others. And then as we get into the Aerodactyl, again, you can see it's a 53%, which is also the same as Charizard, Pikachu, and Gyarados, which is really cool. And again, this is the far-fetched version. This does not play Primeape, and I think it is the best. It has the highest win rate, and it's probably for good reason. You have a lot more options. You have early game attackers. You don't have to wait to evolve. You have more space in your deck to play other cards, and it just so happens that it has about a 1 to 2% higher win rate than the Primeape version. But one deck I want to talk about more than any other deck is the Celebi EX, and it's because it has a whopping 54% win rate. Now, of course, Again, and I'll say it again, Executor EX at 2 in this deck is the one I'm specifically looking at. Anyone that has 2 Execute, 1 Executor EX, and 1 Baby Executor, regardless of which one, I'm not looking at any of those builds. So that one specific build has around a 54% win rate. All other Celebi decks have a lower win rate than that. So again, if I combined and compiled all the different top Celebi decks, that win rate would significantly drop, which is not what we want to look at, because what we want to do is we want to look at what are the best decks and what are the best versions of each deck. And so again, it's the one with the 2 Executor EX, the Celebi, and the Superior all in the same deck, and that one comes out to about a 54% win rate, which is incredible, higher than all the other decks on this pie chart. But the interesting thing is even though it has the highest win rate, I still don't think it's even in the top 3 decks. I still think Pikachu, Gyarados, and Mewtwo are better than this. For one, all 3 of those decks have a higher top-in rate and a higher finish rate. These cards get into tops more often and also win tournaments more. So it's super duper interesting that even though it has one of the highest win rates of all time, it does not win as often in the actual tournament itself. It doesn't win the tournament. But with that being said, usually at this point I would do a top and chart and the percentage of the tops that these decks all take up of. However, I did not compile that information this week. But what I will do is the next one we will look at is which decks won tournaments this week. And I looked at 12 tournaments, so let's get into it. So this is the breakdown for decks that won tournaments this week. And as you can see, as I said, it was 12 tournaments, and there was no Mewtwo or Celebi, as I previously mentioned. No Mewtwo with the highest meta share, one of the highest top-in rates, and well, it does have one of the lower win rates, but this deck in Mewtwo does win tournaments, and it does win tournaments often. However, this week it did not win any of the 12 tournaments that I looked at with 250 or more people. But then as we get into it, what I'll do first is I'll talk about the gray, the one with the Pokemon card back, and that is the other column part of the column that a deck that wasn't any of the decks that we previously looked at that won a tournament. And what it was actually a Gyarados deck, but instead of having Greninja, it was a Gyarados, Druddigon, and Tauros deck. If you want the breakdown for that deck, check out my top 10 decks of the week that I posted yesterday or on Monday, January 13th, and you'll be able to see that deck and the full deck breakdown. But that one of the 12 tournaments this week. Arcanine and Moltres, very big week for Fire. Fire does not often finish tournaments in the first place position. However, this week it won 3 tournaments, 1 with the Arcanine Moltres Mew EX build, and 2 with the Charizard EX Moltres and Arcanine build. In fact, not only did it win 2 tournaments, but in one of the tournaments it won, it actually had a first and second place finish. So that's super interesting. But now let's get into the big decks of the week. The top 2 decks, in my opinion, in the entire game right now, and that is Pikachu EX and Gyarados EX, both coming out on top with 4 wins. Now you can consider Gyarados as 5 wins because, as I just said, the one other one is Gyarados EX as well, but it didn't play the Greninja. And of course, the blue portion of the pie chart is taken up by the standard Gyarados, Druddigon, and Greninja builds. And of course, the Pikachu EX is the Zebstrika build, and so they both finished at 4 and 4. It is important to note that Gyarados not only did it win 4, potentially 5 if you consider the other one, but it also placed in the finals 8 times out of the 12 tournaments. Had 8 finalist appearances, 4 of which they won, and 4 of which they got second place. 2 of those tournaments they were first and second, and then again, of course, if you had the other Gyarados deck that we just talked about with the Doros, it would be 9 total finalists tops. So that is pretty interesting and pretty cool in and of itself. And I keep saying that this is the second best deck, even though it has tremendous stats, tremendous top ends, tremendous win rate, tremendous meta share, tremendous finish rates. The Pikachu EX, I think, is just the best deck. For one, it's a natural counter to this deck that we're specifically talking about. It's one of the most aggressive decks in the game, and in a 20 card deck game, it is super important and super strong to have really good aggro decks. But on top of that, and this is the most important thing, it doesn't matter about win rate, doesn't matter about meta share, it doesn't matter about top end rate. What matters is how often you finish as the winning deck, in my opinion. You can have a different opinion, it's totally okay. But Pikachu, week after week after week after week, constantly wins tournaments. Yes, other decks constantly win too, but there are some weeks where these decks, things like Gyarados, just don't win. And then there's some weeks like Mewtwo, like I said, that does win a lot, but then this week it didn't win at all. Same with Celebi, same thing with Arcanine and Charizard. The last couple of weeks, when you've looked at the meta reports, sometimes these decks were not in the pie chart like the one we're looking at now. However, the one that is consistently and constantly there, and not just at one tournament but multiple tournaments in that week, and they're all the biggest tournaments of the week, is Pikachu EX. This deck, without a shout of a doubt, is the best deck in the game right now, and probably has been since the beginning. There was always a debate between Pikachu and Mewtwo at the beginning during Genetic Apex. I think now, if it's so much stronger now in Mythical Island, and it didn't even get that much of an improvement, you could say it got stronger because of the other decks that came up in the meta, things like Gyarados. However, I just believe it's way too consistent and way too strong, and has too many winning tournament results to not be considered the best deck in the game right now. But anyways, that is it for the meta report this week. I hope you liked it. Leave a comment in the comment section below. Like, subscribe, and share. And as always, keep cooking.